Hello. This, I think, marks my true, official first BookTube video that I've done yet that's like this book oriented. But today I want to do a spoiler-free review, chit-chat, tips, tricks, all about the Maasiverse. No spoilers. I know when I was first going into the Maasiverse, a video like this would have been very useful for me, and I definitely would have watched the crap out of it, so that's why I wanted to make this video. So if you are reading ACOTAR or Throne of Glass or Crescent City, but you haven't read all of them together yet, or whatever order you're reading them in, if you haven't finished the whole thing, if you're not sure about starting the Maasiverse or where to start, this video is for you. We are going to start off with the series that I read first, which is the ACOTAR series. And how I have the books laid out right now is exactly how I read them, the order that I read them in. But we're going to start with ACOTAR. Stay. I will get those in a minute. So I read ACOTAR first, and I do have the paperback version of A Court of Thorns and Roses. I just loaned it out to a friend who I am trying to get started reading on ACOTAR, so that's why I don't have it at the moment. But I also have the collector's edition of A Court of Thorns and Roses. I started this series back in September of 2023 was when I first started ACOTAR. And I started it because I saw a lot of hype, a lot of talk around it on Book Talk, which is a space that I hadn't really been in a long time. I actually hadn't read a book for pleasure that was a fiction book, let alone like a fantasy book, in over a decade at that point. So this was my first return back into reading in general, really, like reading for pleasure. This was the first book back into it. I loved this book, but I also had no idea when I was reading this book, or when I decided to read this book, that I was also committing to reading a 15-book universe. I didn't know. I was very uninvolved in that at that point in time, in what kind of a commitment this was. Not necessarily that in a bad way, or that it has to be a commitment. Like, you can totally just read the ACOTAR series on its own and not even touch the other series if you don't want to. That's not what I would advise, just because I do think if you enjoy the ACOTAR series, you will enjoy the other series as well, and you'll love I'm trying to not spoil things. You'll love like the Easter eggs kind of along the way. I feel like it's pretty broad knowledge that all of Sarah J. Maas's books take place within the same universe, which is why it's called the Maasiverse or Maasiverse. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce her name. I kind of go both ways. So I think that's pretty common knowledge for most people. It was not common knowledge for me though. Started with ACOTAR, loved it, devoured it. As soon as I read the first book, I read the second book, and I read this baby in literally a weekend. Like, I started it on Friday night, finished it on a Sunday afternoon. I don't think I slept very much at all. It was incredible. This book made me want to bawl my eyes out. This is a nice little palate cleanser, which, by the way, read this book. A lot of people don't read this book because it is technically just like a novella, kind of like a filler book between A Court of Wings and Ruin and A Court of Silver Flames. So a lot of people skip this book and will just go straight from this one to this one. Don't do that. You read this book because it is not just a filler book. I feel like, yes, it's kind of a palate cleanser, not like there's really not like a plot or a climax or really anything to this book, but it does go through multiple points of views, and it does give a lot of Easter eggs and a lot of information that I think is very useful when going into this book. And I also think that there's a lot of stuff that happens and is alluded to in this teeny tiny little book that will weave its way into the 6th ACOTAR book that we don't know when it's coming yet. The release, we're not sure, but we know that there is another ACOTAR book coming, but we don't know who it's going to be about or anything like that. So I think a lot of the things from this book will be relevant in the 6th book, so please don't skip this one. It actually is really good, and it has a lot of good stuff in it, a lot of background info. Like, it's good. Don't skip this one. It takes like a day to read. Don't skip it. And then A Court of Silver Flames, which, to be honest, without giving spoilers, this book was good. Not my favorite of the series though. Feels like almost a departure from these 4 books. It's still good though, still relevant. Definitely, obviously read it. I know this is the book around Book Talk I feel that gets kind of the most hype out of the series, aside from A Court of Mist and Fury. But a lot of people will say like this one's their favorite, that they relate to this one the most. I didn't experience that. A Court of Mist and Fury is my favorite by far. This one was actually kind of hard for me to get into. I think the main reason why it was hard for me to get into is because these ones were all first person, aside from like some points of view in this one. But for the most part, all of these were first person. This one then made a complete shift to being in third person, which really threw me off and threw me for a loop. I have a hard time really getting into books that are written in third person. I think that's just a me thing. So just be forewarned, like when you get to this book, you may love it. You may just kind of be more indifferent about it. I'm kind of more indifferent about it, but I have a feeling that when I reread this series, I may like it a little bit more. Oh, hello little groundhog, are you lost? So I read this book, I read these first. I read this whole series, probably took me maybe a month to read this whole series. Once I read this series, I then moved on to this series, which is the Throne of Glass series. I did do a little bit of a palette cleanser between these 2 series, and I did ring Fourth Wing and Iron Flame right when it came out, because Iron Flame came out in November, and so I read Fourth Wing that same month, and then read Iron Flame right after it came out, and I am very glad that I did that, because the Throne of Glass series is a very long series. As you can see here, it is an 8-book series. And it is it's a very beefy series. A lot of things change, happen, evolve throughout this series. I will say this is definitely the most extensive world building series that I've ever read. And it takes a lot. So I'm glad that I had a little bit of a lighter, easier read of a palette cleanser between ACOTAR and Throne of Glass, because I think I would have struggled a lot more if I hadn't had a little bit of that break. There's a lot of debate around what order to read the Throne of Glass series in. This is the order that I read it in. I read Assassin's Blade first, then Throne of Glass, Crown of Midnight, Heir of Fire, Queen of Shadows. I did do the tandem read of Empire of Storms and Tower of Dawn, and then obviously finishing with Kingdom of Ash. Now the debate comes in where to read Assassin's Blade, which Assassin's Blade is actually a compilation of a bunch of did I say that right? Prequel? Why does it sound so weird? Prequel stories that Sarah J. Maas released. So this is basically a prequel to the whole entire series. So I read it first because that made sense in my head to read the prequel first and get a lot of the background information, and I really enjoyed reading it like that. Now, there's some people that say you can read it third, so after Throne of Glass and Crown of Midnight, or you can even read it fourth, so after Throne of Glass, Crown of Shadows, Throne of Glass, Crown of Midnight, and Heir of Fire, and then Assassin's Blade. My partner read the series as well, and they actually read Assassin's Blade third. So they read it after Throne of Glass and Crown of Midnight. They really, really liked it that way. I don't think there's a right or wrong way to read it. Sarah J. Maas actually has her recommended reading order as having Assassin's Blade third. So if you want to do how she would recommend it, you can read it that way. I personally really liked having it first because I had no idea what to expect going into the Throne of Glass series. Zero idea. I did a really good job of avoiding any TikToks that even mentioned the Maasiverse at first or mentioned Throne of Glass. Like I did my best to avoid all of that. So I genuinely had no idea what to expect with this series. And for me, that meant that Assassin's Blade was really impactful because it gave me a lot of background information that I think would have made me really frustrated with the main characters if I hadn't read this first. And it also just destroyed my heart at some parts. Whereas when you read it later on in the series, you already kind of know what's going to happen. So it may not have that emotional of an impact, but some people also argue that it has more of an emotional impact because you read it and you know what's going to happen in the end and makes everything else kind of more bittersweet or harder to get through and harder to read emotionally. But I really liked it first. So if you really are looking for someone to tell you, yes, read it in this order, then I will tell you, yes, read it in this order right here. But ultimately, it's up to you. People get heated about it. It's really not that big of a deal. Read it in whatever order you want to read it in. Post-filming Hannah here to mention the thing I somehow forgot to mention, which is you should absolutely do the tandem read with Tower of Dawn and Empire of Storms. So the tandem read, there is a worksheet out there, and I'll see if I can link it down below actually, because it makes it really easy. Breaks out what chapters you should read in each book at what point, and it is so worth it. Just trust me, do the tandem read. Otherwise, I can pretty much guarantee you won't want to read this book at all. So read the tandem read. All of that being said, this series was the hardest for me to get through and took me the longest amount of time, which I think makes sense because it is the beefiest series. But I started reading this in the end of November of 2023, and I didn't finish it until, I want to say, March of this year. So it took me December, January, February. It took me a good 3 or 4 months to finish this whole series. A big part of that is because I didn't really start to get into the series until the end of the 3rd book. So like the end of the 3rd book and start of the 4th book is really where the series starts to get interesting and starts to really pick up, and where I personally started to get way more invested in it, which you might be thinking, like, is it really that good of a series if it takes you 3 or 4 books to really get into it? Yes. Yes, it is really that good of a series. It is worth it. It is definitely worth it. It is so... I still think about this series every single day. So don't skip this series. It is so good. And it also made sense in my head to read the Throne of Glass series after ACOTAR, because I believe that was part of the publishing order as well. Actually, well, so she started releasing some Throne of Glass books first and then started to write ACOTAR and then finished Throne of Glass series. So this series is actually one of her like debut series. I think the Throne of Glass book itself was Sarah J. Maas's debut novel. And you can kind of sense that through some of these earlier books as well. But that's what makes it so beautiful, is because like you really get to witness the growth in her writing and the characters and the worlds throughout the books. But also looking back, hindsight, knowing what I know now about the whole Maasiverse, it makes sense to read this series after ACOTAR, but before Crescent City. So I would just highly recommend you read Throne of Glass series after ACOTAR. It's just, I promise it's going to make so much more sense. Everything's going to work better. And it also makes certain things that happen throughout the books way more mind-blowing, I guess you can say. So definitely this series after ACOTAR. ACOTAR will always have a special place in my heart. It's truly not only a work of art, but it is a masterpiece. And that's all I'm going to say about that. After you've read all of these books, you're going to want to switch to Crescent City, which is the final series in the Maasiverse, at least at this point. Obviously, the 3rd book in the Crescent City series just came out in January of this year, so it also kind of worked out that this was the last series I read, because I knew I wanted to wait until this 3rd book came out before I read Crescent City anyways. This This book right here, House of Earth and Blood, literally single-handedly the best first book of a series that I have ever read. And I like this, so much happens in this book that I think back to this book and I'm like, all of that happened in one book? What the heck? Like this book feels like a series in and of itself. This book was incredible. And nobody talks about it enough. Nobody talks about what an incredible book this is enough. This was literally, I think this was one of my favorite books. It is so freaking good. Word of advice. After reading the Throne of Glass series, unless you are just like a superhero reader, you'll probably need a break. And that's something I failed to recognize. I went directly from the Throne of Glass series into Crescent City, and while the first book was really good, I really started to lose steam at the second and the third book. So I started Crescent City later in March of this year, and I didn't finish it until earlier this month, so early May. So it took me a good 2 months to read just these 3 books because I was really having a hard time getting into it again. Like at that point, I had been reading within the Maasiverse for 8 months. And so I was kind of, while I loved it, I was also really kind of ready and like itching for something different, something new. So that would be my biggest piece of advice is after reading the Throne of Glass series, definitely read like another mini series like a duology or trilogy or a palette cleanser single book, or just read something else and something different so that you can go into Crescent City like ready to fire through it, like recommitted, and that you don't get tired of the series right off the bat. All of that being said, by the time I got to the third book, I think it was more than just me losing steam that made me lose interest in the third book. And that is a criticism that I saw on Book Talk a lot before I even read Crescent City, was that this House of Flame and Shadow was kind of a letdown and a little bit disappointing to read. And I don't ever want to say, I don't ever want to call a book a letdown and say that it's disappointing to read and not as good because, like, hey, you wrote a freaking book. I didn't. So I don't ever want to criticize another author's work like that. I still think it was really good, but a lot of things started to happen really fast all at once, where it was like, okay, wait, what is happening? Like, this all seems like it's tying up really quickly and too nicely and too easily, and it just kind of felt a little bit anticlimactic at parts. So I think it was a combination of me, losing steam reading through all of these books, while also this book just moving at a pace that was a lot faster than the others, that by the time I got to this book, I literally got to a point where I was like, I might DNF this book. I don't know if I can finish it. I did finish it. I pushed through, and I'm glad that I finished it, but I'm also very excited to be done with it. I think as a whole, Crescent City was probably my least favorite series, but this book was probably one of my most favorite books. And then ACOTAR, I think, is my favorite series, but Throne of Glass is just on a different level. Like, Throne of Glass is more of like an epic, I feel, and less of like a series. Like, it's just, it feels like it ranks differently because it's just like on a different playing field than ACOTAR and Crescent City is. That is my long-winded spiel, spoiler-free review of the Maasiverse. I will say I am forever changed as a person reading this whole entire universe. Not only did I get into it at a time when I really needed it the most because of a lot of other things going on in my life, I really needed like this escape and this comfort that books brought me, but it also literally made me realize I want different things for my life. Like, I changed my job during the course of reading this. I changed my aesthetic and how I dressed because I realized I wanted to embody how I felt on the inside of wanting to be more fantasy, fantastical. So this universe helped me realize a lot of who I am, both physically and aesthetically, how I want to outwardly present, but also inwardly, what my values are, what my morals are, how I feel. It just is so much more than just a universe. If you are thinking of getting started in the Maasiverse and you are unsure, I say go for it. Just start with ACOTAR. You know, you don't have to think about all of these other books right now. Just start with this one. Everything else will kind of happen and fall into place as it should and as you want it to. I do also want to do another video where I kind of talk about the interplay between these series and different theories that we can talk about and discuss, but I want to flesh those out more, and that video will obviously have a lot of spoilers, so I'll be sure to disclaim that one bright, bold, big, because I don't want to spoil anything for anybody here. This one was just spoiler free for anybody wanting to get started reading or in the middle of reading and just kind of wants to talk to someone who has read the whole thing in a very general, broad, top view kind of way. So yeah, that is the Maasiverse. I highly recommend. I still don't know what book I'm going to be reading next. I feel kind of lost. Like, I'm excited to read other books, but also for the past 9 months, I've had a clear trajectory and roadmap of what books I'm going to read next, and now I have none. So it's a little bit like a midlife crisis, but like a book life crisis. But I wouldn't change it for the world. I loved the series. I love the Maasiverse. It is something very special and near and dear to me, and I hope if you read it that you enjoy it as well. But let me know down in the comments below if you have already read the Maasiverse or what series you're reading or any questions you have. Please, 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 please try to keep the comments as spoiler free as possible. I don't want anybody to go down there and see something that they don't mean to see and have, you know, really good parts of the series get messed up and ruined for them. So if you can keep it spoiler free, that would be much appreciated. Let me know if you like this video, if you want me to do more of them. I appreciate you being here, and I hope you stick around. Bye!